And welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. It's 6/9/21. Well, now that the pandemic appears to have gone out with a whimper, certainly in many parts of these here United States, although there are countries that have probably countries like Canada, maybe they'll make a mask mandate permanent. Maybe the restrictions will become permanent. You have to wonder. The rates are falling like a stone. You may like or not like the vaccines, but certainly they appear to have brought down the incidence, the rate of COVID down. Can we please get back to normal? That's the question. Well, conferences are taking place in Florida and around the country. So in that regard, maybe we're getting back to normal. Our good friend George Gammon is with us now. George, great to have you back on. And you've got a conference going on very shortly in Miami. Tell us about it.
I do. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Kerry. It's always great to talk to you. But yeah, we've got Rebel Capitalist Live going on, and we set this up about maybe 4 months ago, something like that. And I thought, back then, Florida wasn't as open as it is today, and the country wasn't as open. And I thought, we have to get back to normalcy. Human beings are not meant to be locked up in a cage, and they're not meant to just communicate with people over Zoom or Skype. They're actually meant to communicate with people face to face. And so I set this conference up. It was, back then, it was quite a bit of a risk because you didn't know if we were going to have this second wave or the states would shut back down. I assumed that Florida wouldn't. And that's why I did the event here in the first place. And pretty much every speaker I got in touch with was not only said yes, but was super, super excited because they're in the same boat. They're like, thank you so much, George, for doing this. It's, I haven't been out of my house, or I haven't been to any conferences in the last year and a half, and I'm so anxious to get back to it. And we had a huge response from the people buying tickets. So I think pretty much everyone out there, at least the people that are coming to my conference, are ready to get back to normal and, take advantage of hearing speakers face-to-face, interacting with like-minded individuals to help them make better decisions in the future, financial decisions.
And really, maybe that is your biggest contribution to date, George, is like, hey, we can actually have a conference where real live people can show up. Look, I've been dealing in Zoom and Skype and every other messaging, digital communications platform for years now and working from my home. So for me, honestly, COVID, the whole pandemic, not a big deal from that standpoint. But in terms of the rest of your life, of actually meeting with people and going to conferences, traveling, all those little things. Really, we've gone the past year. The last airplane flight I took was in March of 2020. Now I'm about to go into New York, Las Vegas, Wyoming for a mine tour. Finally getting back to normal. So it's got to feel really good for you as well as the group that's going to be there, all 700 of them.
It does. And what really drove this home for me is, in fact, I was right in your neck of the woods there. I was in West Palm, and I had lunch with Jeff Snyder, who most people know from FinTwit and Real Vision and Macro Voices and his own podcast. And, brilliant guy. But he's someone that I've interviewed for my channel at least 4 or 5 times. And I've heard him on Macro Voices just tons of times. I've heard him on Real Vision. And so it's not that his ideas were new to me, in the Eurodollar and the monetary system and whatnot. But I was able to meet him for lunch and sit down and talk to him face to face for about an hour and a half. And I learned more in that hour and a half of talking with him face to face than I did by the 4 or 5 times I've actually interviewed him and the 100 podcast episodes or videos that I've seen him featured on Real Vision or YouTube. It's something about talking to someone and looking them in the eye and going back and forth with the dialogue that just you cannot replace.
Yeah, well, it's so true. It's called human connection. And
Yeah.
we're social creatures. So maybe that's been the worst damage from all of these insane COVID lockdown restrictions, is restricting you from getting together with business associates, with friends. Because look, I mean, I will confess that the world's becoming more virtual. A lot of conferences that used to take place face to face no longer do. They're virtual conferences, largely a question of economics, that people don't want to pay thousands of dollars to go to trivial conferences anymore. But there still are conferences in every industry that you have to go to. You got to be there, that you're really missing out on something if you don't. So everybody says that everything's changing, the new normal and all that. But have people really changed through the pandemic?
No, they haven't. That's an easy question to answer.
Yeah, it's so true. So as far as the global economy, though, that has changed. That's been drastically affected. We see these supply chain disruptions all over the place, whether it's semiconductors, food, throw in a couple of acts of cyber terrorism, and you got a dystopian world that's shaping up before our very eyes.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to understanding what wealth is. And I'll kind of go off on a tangent here, but I'll pull it back around. If most people think of wealth as the amount of dollars or currency units that they have, they think it's in their bank account, but they don't realize that their bank account is really just an electronic liability of the commercial banking system. There's nothing really tangible in there. They can redeem that liability for cash, but it's just basically an IOU, saying IOU IOUs, because the dollar in and of itself is an IOU. But this is what people associate wealth with, is the amount of currency units. And people have to get out of this mindset, because if that were true, then Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Weimar Germany would have been the most wealthy countries in human history. But we know they're not. So why is that? It's because wealth is measured by the amount of goods and services a society can create or produce efficiently. And it's just that example I always use, I got from Schiff, that, if you're on a desert island and all you have is a case full of $1 billion, are you richer or are you poor? And the answer is obviously you're poor, because you can't buy anything. There's no stuff there. And so once we realize that, once we see the world and economics and everything the government and the Fed is doing through that lens, we can start to see the damage that all these distortions are creating. So let's look at the stimulus checks as an example. So all these stimulus checks go out, the government, $5 trillion in deficit spending. We're going to have stimulus package after stimulus package. What you have to ask yourself, just to get down to the nitty gritty, is this action the government is taking, is this going to create an environment where we're producing more goods and services or fewer goods and services in the past? And I think especially when you look at these additional unemployment benefits and stimulus checks, yes, I guess there's kind of an argument that they could have been needed there for a while, but now you've got the government competing with employers, and most people are choosing, well, not most, but a lot of people are choosing to stay home. You can see it in all the statistics where and you can see it anecdotally in your own life too. I mean, I'm sitting here in a parking lot talking to you in front of a restaurant, and the restaurant has signs up in every single window. And it's not about a daily special. Every sign says we're hiring. We're hiring. Every single sign. And I'm sure the people listening to this right now have experienced that in their own life. Every single business out there is short on employees. They just can't get people to work. And I think that's a direct result of these distortions of the stimulus checks and of the additional unemployment benefits. And again, you have to ask yourself, over the long run, does this create an economy that is producing more or producing less? And I think the obvious answer is that we're going to produce less, and therefore, regardless of how many currency units we have in our bank accounts, as an aggregate total, we're going to be poorer.
And that means inflation, right? Or actually, we have to specify that, because technically inflation is an increase in the money supply. What most people think of, most of you out there think of when you think of inflation, is rising consumer prices, paying more at the gas pump, paying more at the supermarket, all of those things. Now, that's really a byproduct of inflation, and that's why most of you out there don't really understand what inflation is. So money supply, excess money supply can be soaked up in a number of ways: higher asset prices, higher real estate, etc., higher home prices. We've seen that happen. But now we're starting to see higher commodity prices and higher consumer prices, and that makes a society poorer, doesn't it?
Yeah, because usually incomes are going to lag the cost of goods and services. And, you know, it's interesting. I saw that Janet Yellen came out, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day prior or something like that, and started to acknowledge that this inflation we're seeing, as far as consumer price inflation, may not be transient. But her point was, even if it's not transient, it's not that bad. We should look at it as the economy is booming. And why is a booming economy something that should be frowned upon? And you have to, these Keynesians, or the people like Janet Yellen or Powell, and it's laughable that they think that just prices going up somehow implies that the economy or society, the standard of living, is actually increasing for the average Joe and Jane. But I think in the back of her mind, if we assume she's has a degree of integrity, which I'll give her the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, well, we could debate that one, but let's just say, for the sake of our discussion here, George, she's a person of the highest integrity.
Yeah, I think how she can square that circle is, if you see inflation, you realize that the banking system, and again, I want to preface by saying this is kind of how the way it was in the past, and I'll get back to this. But I think in her mind, she sees inflation as the lesser of two evils, in the sense that it at least shows that the banking system is a little healthier, in the sense that they're creating more loans. Because if they're creating more loans, then theoretically you're increasing the money supply. Therefore, you're seeing inflation. Therefore, if you see inflation, that implies that there's a lot of lending going on, and that implies that the banking system is healthy. Now, anyone would say, well, that's kind of half true, because then you've got the standard of living going down for the average Joe, because their wages aren't going up at the same rate as the price they're paying at the grocery store. But again, I think that's why she thinks it may be the lesser of two evils. The problem with that is that's looking at the system the way it has been for the last, I don't know, let's say since Bretton Woods, where, excuse me, so where the commercial banking system was actually responsible for creating the majority of the dollars that we had in the system, especially domestically. And then we got the Eurodollar system, where international banks started to create dollar deposits, dollar commercial bank liabilities. And that grew exponentially. And that's kind of how the system works. So it wasn't that the Fed was really in control of the dollar. Really, it was the commercial banking system. I always say it wasn't necessarily Jerome Powell. It's more Jamie Dimon that's in control of the dollar. But now what happened once we had COVID is we turned into this kind of hybrid system where the government, their deficits are so large, and they're being monetized by the Fed. And this is something where now the government is actually increasing the money supply, especially when you look at just straight M2. And that's why when you look at the M2 charts going back to 2020, you see that M2 broad money increased by like 25% in 1 year. Well, how does that happen? It's because the government is spending all this money and they're not sucking the money out of the system before they spend it. So normally they would suck the money out by the private sector buying bonds or paying taxes. But now what they're doing is they're just spending the money, and the Fed's buying those treasuries with bank reserves that they just create out of thin air, funny money. And therefore you get on aggregate total, on net balance, you get an increase in the money supply. So that's where I think Janet Yellen's thinking is rather flawed, in the sense that she's looking at the past and kind of the rear view mirror, even if we're giving her the benefit of the doubt, where I think she needs to look at the way things are and where they're going. And if we're moving from this hybrid system where the government now is in control of the amount of dollars, and they're taking that away from the banking system, I think the Fed, if they're smart, is going to look at that and say, well, this is, now we've got the politicians in charge of creating new dollars. This is worse than having Jamie Dimon in control. Yeah. So we need to take back control. We need to actually be a central bank, and we need to be the center of the dollar monetary system. And really the only way they can achieve that, in my opinion, is by setting up a central bank digital currency, by banning cash, so we all have accounts with the Fed, and therefore they're in charge, or they can issue loans directly into the real economy, which will increase the supply of dollars. And I'd like to remind everyone listening right now that the Fed is the third central bank we've had in the United States. The first one was set up by Alexander Hamilton. And if you read why he wanted a central bank, it wasn't just to fund the government. It was actually more so to fund the private sector and to issue loans directly to businesses and individuals. That's what he wanted the central bank to do, the first one. And I think the Fed is going to go back to the central bank and what they used to do. And just to reiterate, that's where the Fed will be in control of not only consumer but business lending as well. They'll circumnavigate the commercial bank and get around the politicians.
All right. Well, I like the idea of it for sure. And I only hope that they see the wisdom of your ways, George. And, hey, we just have to hope that it happens, right?
Well, there's a give and take there, because now you're really centralizing the control of lending. And, I don't know that for my next mortgage, I want to have to ask Jerome Powell for it.
Yeah.
So that's a little scary.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So it's like, who do you want to control this? The banksters or the central banksters? It's really damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Absolutely. Well, I could not agree with you more, George. Hey, conference sounds great. Sorry I won't be there, but maybe I'll catch the next one. People want to connect with you on the web, watch your videos. Where do you go?
Oh, you can just Google my name. It's first name George, typical spelling, last name Gammon, Gammon. That'll pull up all the YouTube, the Twitter, the Instagram, and my website.
Excellent. Hey, and if you got a question for George, we will email it off to him. Just send it to me, kl@kerrylutz.com. Promise we'll get back to you on it. And don't forget, sign up for your free newsletter on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. George, good luck on the conference. Pleasure to talk to you again, and stay well and stay free.
All right. Thanks, Kerry.